Welcome back everyone. Today we continue with the next part of this series called What If Future Gohan Was Never Killed by the Androids. Let's aim for 350 likes on this one. Also, don't forget to leave a comment letting me know if you've enjoyed the series so far. With that, let's begin. 18 was feeling generous, so she allowed the janitor to retreat back into the building with his life. She had other things on her mind than some janitor. Maybe if she was feeling particularly cruel, she could watch and wait for the man to leave the building. Then she could stealthily follow him home and, just as he felt safe under the covers of his bed, she would creep up and end his life by dismemberment. The thought of watching the limbless man scream as blood gushed out of his body amused her. It was funny how people always felt so safe in their homes. Home. She mulled the word over repeatedly in her mind. She didn't know why, but whenever the word came up, she always thought momentarily of the doctor's laboratory. Maybe it's because my very first memories are there, she thought. She remembered sitting up from the cold table, confused, with her brother standing cross-armed at her side. She was initially scared, mostly due to the memory loss. Forgetting your very name can be very unnerving. She got over it relatively quickly, as the next emotion that washed over her was rage. Finding out that some asshole had kidnapped her and her brother before running some horrid experiments on them set the two off, and thus started the beginning of the end of Gero's life. Sure, it had been a drag for the first few days, having to do everything he commanded in fear of being blown up from a simple press of a button he controlled. But once 17 had lured the scientist into a false sense of security and managed to swipe the remote away, it was simply a matter of deciding how to kill him. 17 had chosen to behead him. She then remembered that the lab was still there, or at least as far as she knew. She didn't think 17 ever mentioned returning to that place and destroying it, though they had talked about it a few times. She remembered how it looked, such a cliché mad scientist lab, with standard large human-filled test tubes and a giant operating table at the side of the room. He even had the standard metal reflective flooring to make the place look sinister, and she always laughed whenever she thought about that ridiculously large supercomputer at the very end of the lab. God, why couldn't I have been made by an original mad scientist? And that computer too. What has to be that big? What could it possibly store? Her eyes widened slightly as she realized what it could contain, and that it was probably still functional. If she chose to, she could probably access the computer, finding both her and her brother's files. She could find everything about them. She could maybe even find out her real name, and from that, she could find out who she was. And with her brother's blueprints, she could even revive 17. Holy shit, 18 muttered as the sudden realization hit her. Why hadn't she ever thought of this before? She remembered mulling it over in her head, but the thought had always been interrupted by something. Maybe 17 had said something and distracted her, or maybe she had been in the middle of killing someone. Perhaps it had been during a fight with that bastard Gohan. Anyhow, it didn't matter why she had never thought of it before. What mattered was that she finally had the thought now. 18 jumped off the building, letting herself fall halfway down the length of the tower before pulling up and flying in the direction of where she remembered Gero's lab to be. She allowed herself a giggle as she heard people screaming below, pointing at her as if she were a suicide jumper. The screams turned to those of terror as they realized it was an android. I could do with a change in scenery. Mountains, here I come. Several hours later, finding the structure hidden in one of those blasted mountain caves had been a drag. It had taken 2 entire hours of searching through cave after cave before she finally found the place. She was a calm person, but she could only handle so much. She decided to release her frustration with a magic trick, making a mountain disappear. When she approached the 2 steel doors, she initially charged a powerful photon beam in her hand to knock them down, but she reconsidered. For the short time she had known Gero, she had recognized his extreme caution, not wanting anyone to take control of any of his creations. This was one of the reasons he had built the android destroying button in the first place. He was the type of person who, if he couldn't have it, no one could. She worried that if she did try to knock the door down, it might trigger some sort of self-destruction sequence, erasing any and all data involving her and her brother. She paced back and forth, scanning for some form of keypad or lock, but the doors appeared completely flat. After several minutes, she finally shouted in anger, "God damn it, how in the hell did this asshole Gero get into his lab?" She startled as a hidden speaker above her crackled to life and a robotic voice said, "Voice recognition confirmed. Welcome back from your mission, Android 18. The doors began to slowly creak open, finally allowing her to enter the decade-old laboratory. She tilted her head up at the speaker embedded in the roof of the cave and said, "I guess I just had to speak up." She walked onto the dusty, hard floor and took a quick look around. The place looked hardly any different than when she and her brother had left it. Gero's decapitated body still lay collapsed in the center of the room. The blood had turned brown and begun to crust off. She looked up at the flickering ceiling lights. No doubt almost all of them were now burnt out. Carefully stepping over Gero's body with her white sneakers, she made her way to the large computer resting at the back wall of the room. Looking up at the dusty black screen, she began to question whether the computer would even turn on. The lights have been running on something all this time, right? There could still be enough power to turn this thing on. She reached across the large keyboard and pressed down on the key that originally started up the computer. No response. 5 minutes later, being the stubborn person she was, she decided to try different lengths of time holding the power button and rapidly pressing it. But alas, the computer would not turn on, meaning this whole endeavor had been pointless. With an exasperated sigh, 18 began to walk toward the exit but stopped as one of the large capsules attached to the wall caught her eye. She walked up to them and stared at the 2 open metal capsules from which she and her brother had been stored and released. The numbers 17 and 18 were printed on them. Beside the open 17 capsule was a whole line of capsules with numbers decreasing in order from 16 to 13. She stared at the capsules labeled 13, 14, and 15. How odd. I could have sworn those weren't here when 17 and I were released. She pried her attention away from the mysterious capsules and stared at the capsule neighboring her brother's. Android 16. I'm a little curious about what came before me and my brother. I wonder if I could turn you on. She began to fiddle with and push the buttons that had originally activated each android. She knew how it was done from watching Gero turn on her brother after he had released her for her next mission. After several minutes of no success, she understood that the power had also been depleted here and that opening the doors with button commands would be pointless. So naturally, she decided to tear the capsule door off. She took a few steps back as she stared, gaping, at the still figure of 16. The man was huge, easily twice her height, with a strange black spandex-type suit and neon green upper body armor resting on top. She stared at his serious face, which contrasted awkwardly with his abnormal orange mohawk. The man remained asleep and still for the few minutes that 18 stared at him. She laughed at the fact that she had actually thought the android might come to life. Of course, he would be a dead battery. It had been about 13 years since the last time the lab had been maintained. There was no way this guy could still operate after so long. She turned to open the next capsule when she suddenly saw a neon green boot step out of the Takuno 16 capsule, followed by the rest of the android's frame. Holy shit, she murmured under her breath, staring up at the Goliath of a man standing in front of her. He turned and faced her, staring straight into her eyes as he said, "You are Android 18. She slowly nodded, feeling a wave of tension and fear. She and her brother had murdered Gero. Had he somehow programmed his creations to want revenge? But me and my brother were the latest and last models. There's nothing before us that's stronger, right? A long eerie silence was broken by the sound of one of the few remaining ceiling lights buzzing loudly before finally cracking and giving out. The huge man looked up at the broken light bulb, breaking eye contact with 18. Now's my chance, 18 immediately thought. She launched herself at the larger android, smashing a devastating knee directly into his face, sending him crashing through the metallic wall across the room, barely missing the large computer screen. She then turned and bolted out of the lab and cave mouth, flying into the air and turning to face the entrance. She aimed a steady hand at the entrance and charged a powerful photon beam, waiting for him to exit. Nearly half a minute went by before the giant android finally emerged from the cave, walking calmly out onto the cave's mouth. 18 fired at him, but he easily swatted the beam away, causing it to barrel through the mountain opposite theirs. He looked up and stared at her with his serious face still as stone. Not bad, she thought. But how about this? She placed both her open palms together and began firing volley after volley of golden blasts at the cave mouth. Her eyes widened as she saw each and every blast being smacked away in rapid succession. She stared at the man's face, still blank and serious as ever. She ceased her blasts and glared at him, who calmly stared back, her fists clenched as she prepared for a fight. "Why do you attack me, fellow android?" "Huh?" She looked at him with wide eyes. I thought you were going to attack." 16's face remained impassive. "No, I would not have attacked you." 18 stared at him for a few seconds, thinking, "But will you attack me now?" She shouted back, hoping to prevent a fight with this man. "I'm sorry for attacking you." 16's response was immediate. "I accept your apology. Why did you wake me, Android 18? She stammered. She hadn't had a reason, she was just curious. "Wait, he's been in that system far longer than me. Maybe he can help." "I wanted your help," she shouted back. 16 responded with the same serious tone. "With what do you need my assistance, Android 18? He didn't appear to be shouting, but his voice echoed loud and clear across the air and into her ears. She was slightly intimidated by his deep robotic voice. 18's own thoughts cut her off. What if he's trying to trick me? He could be luring me into a trap just like 17 did with Gero. Hell, Gero probably programmed him to kill with a sense of irony. Instead of stating any of those thoughts, she said, I wish to learn about my anatomy, but the computer doesn't work. 16 turned away to look back into the cave towards the lab. He returned his gaze to 18 and said, I might be able to reactivate it, though it may take some time. You can wait inside if you so choose. With that, he turned and stepped back inside the cave and out of view. 18 continued floating there, contemplating her next move. She could simply blow up the entire mountain. The android probably wouldn't expect that and could be destroyed in the process. But what if he's actually telling the truth? She thought to herself. She decided against destroying the lab as she still wanted to learn about herself and her brother. And if 16 could actually fix that computer, then she would finally know who she was and maybe be able to resurrect her brother. On the other hand, there was still a chance that he was trying to trap and destroy her. She weighed her options for a minute before thinking, it's worth the risk. She carefully and slowly floated down to the cave mouth and re-entered the lab. She approached 16 warily and watched as he pulled off the panel resting underneath the large keyboard and began to dig around the many wires and circuits. Ooh, 18 said out of sheer awkwardness that came from the silence. So, what are you doing? 16 answered quickly. The main reason a computer may not be activating is a faulty motherboard or CPU, both of which I am now searching for. Oh, of course, 18 responded dumbly. She didn't actually know what those parts did, but they sounded important. 16 turned his attention away from inside the panel and said, could you hand me the screwdriver over there? She found the rusty tool and handed it to him, which he took and immediately went back to work. There were a few minutes of silence as 16 worked before finally emerging from the wires with a strangely shaped device in his hand. Huh, she said as she stared at it. So what now? I have confirmed that this motherboard has indeed malfunctioned. I believe Gero left spare computer parts for events like this before his demise. As 16 finished his sentence, he moved past 18 and opened a large cabinet attached to the side of the room. She said nervously as he mentioned Gero's death. You don't have any quarrels about that, do you? What do you mean? He asked calmly as he carefully pulled from the cabinet a similar object to the one he had pulled from the computer panel. He floated the device above his hand, using his key to make sure it didn't touch anything but air. The device must have been fragile. Well, you know how 17, do you know how the doctor died? 18 asked awkwardly, her eyes darting nervously. 16, focused on his task, walked back to the computer and knelt down to reach the panel. Without turning around, he answered in his usual calm manner. Yes, 17 ended his life with your encouragement. 18 gulped, feeling a knot in her stomach. Yeah, so, you have no anger involving that, right? 16, now reinserting the motherboard with meticulous care, replied, I do not. My primary objective was to kill Goku, as was with all of us. I care not for my creator unless he orders me to do so. A sigh of relief escaped 18's lips. The tension in her shoulders eased as she spoke with a bit more confidence. So you don't feel the need for revenge for the death of our creator? Incorrect. 18's heart skipped a beat. She took a step back, instinctively raising her fist, ready for a fight. But 16 continued. He did not create you, 18. I was his last fully artificial creation. You and your brother were originally human, whom he took and modified. You are not actually an android technically by the term. The term that should be used is cyborg, for that is what you and your brother are. Oh, 18 said, her arms dropping to her sides as the realization sank in. Then why'd he call us androids? He wished to instill fear in the general population. He did not want anyone thinking of you as any less frightening by learning that you were once human. It is the reason he erased your and your brother's memories. 18 felt a shiver run down her spine, unnerved by how much this android knew about her past. How do you know so much about my brother and me? 16 closed the panel with a light clang of metal hitting metal and stood up. He began typing at the keyboard, explaining, 6 years ago, when the motherboard first began to malfunction, it accidentally pulled down the firewall against my connection, allowing me to search through the database. I know quite a lot about each of Gero's creations. Really? 18's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. So can you tell me how to revive my brother? 16 answered swiftly, his demeanor unchanging. I did not know that 17 was deceased. 18 sighed heavily, frustration seeping into her voice. He was killed by an Earth fighter named Gohan. 16's movements froze at the mention of the name. He slowly turned, his eyes wide with shock. 18 took a step back, startled by his sudden change in expression. She didn't know he could even look surprised. 16's voice boomed with urgency. Gohan still lives. 18 stared back, unsure how to respond to his intense gaze. Yeah, are there any more blood relatives of Goku still remaining? 16 pressed on, his tone desperate for information. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure Gohan was Goku's only child. A hint of annoyance crept into 16's voice. When I found out that Goku had been killed, I assumed that you or your brother had killed his son as well. We've been trying, 18 said, her frustration mirroring his. Her eyes widened as she noticed the computer screen flickering on behind 16. Yet after so long you have still failed in your mission. Has he grown too strong to kill? 16's voice carried a hint of reproach as he fixed his gaze on 18. 18 stammered, desperate to redirect his attention back to the computer screen. I doubt it. The only reason he was able to kill 17 was because he got a cheap shot in. Understood, so together we could easily overtake him, correct? 16's tone was unwavering, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. Maybe. 18's voice wavered with anxiety. She feared 16 would suddenly take off in search of Gohan, leaving her alone to figure out the massive computer. Speaking urgently, she said, we should look up 17's file. If we repair and revive him, the three of us could easily kill Gohan. Negative. 16's response was immediate and firm. What? 18 blinked in disbelief. 17 was originally human. If Gohan managed to kill him, it means he targeted one of 17's remaining vital organs. While it would be possible to revive him had he been completely composed of artificial parts, he was not. Therefore, we cannot revive him. The information hit 18 like a bullet to the chest. Her shoulders drooped, and she looked down, her eyes rimmed with tears. She couldn't handle the truth. How could 17 be dead? He was supposed to be immortal. There was always a way to survive, so why didn't he? Sorry, brother. I can't bring you back. Several minutes later, both she and 16 stared at the large computer screen as it finally booted up. It suddenly went to a black screen with white letters and digits listing themselves down the screen. It appears that the computer has to update itself, 16 said quietly. 18 averted her gaze to the floor, no longer interested in the screen. What was the point of it all now? It will take multiple days before it is ready for use, 16 continued. 18's eyebrows scrunched up in frustration. She lifted her head and asked, why's that? 16 looked down at her, explaining, Gero created the computer to keep itself updated on current events so that there would be little to no unpredictable complications involving his works. 18 said, slightly intrigued. So why does it take so long to update? I don't remember Gero ever having to stop his work because his computer had to update. It has been 4 years since the computer shut down. Now that it's up and running, it has to catch up on 4 years of information involving the world. I guess that makes sense, 18 muttered, a little annoyed at how long it would take for the machine to return to functionality, but she knew she would deal with it. A long silence ensued as both androids stared at the screen. After a few minutes, 18 finally broke the silence by asking, so, what now? That's it for this episode, guys. If you've watched to the end, then that may be an indication that you enjoy the episode, so please drop a like so the video could reach more people. See you in the next episode. Take care.